Good evening, everyone. Hello. I see everyone streaming in. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Paige Berger, and I am the marketing director here at Barrett Bookstore. I'm broadcasting to you live tonight from Darien, Connecticut, with my behind-the-scenes event coordinator, Reena Ninan, and our distinguished guests, Dr. Traci Baxley and Reena Ninan, whom I will introduce in a moment. I want to start tonight by offering up deep gratitude to those in the community who provided support as we plan this evening: the YWCA of Darien Norwalk, the Darien Library, the Council of Darien School Parents, and Rage Time Connecticut. Thank you so much to all of you. We are here tonight to celebrate the release of Dr. Traci Baxley's new book, Social Justice Parenting: How to Raise Compassionate, Anti-Racist, Justice-Minded Kids in an Unjust World. Dr. Baxley's new book is an empowering, timely guide to raising compassionate and socially conscious kids. As the mother of 3 children, when I initially learned about Dr. Baxley's book, I selfishly thought this is the book that I need right now. I have to say it's been so gratifying over the past several days and weeks to enter in community with so many others who feel the same. To those of you joining us remotely tonight to learn more about the concepts of radical love, belonging, compassion, and open dialogue, among other things, we're so glad you're here. In this book, Dr. Baxley delivers essential guidance and curriculum, suggests that parenting is a form of activism, and encourages parents to acknowledge their influence in developing compassionate, socially conscious kids. While we can only spend about an hour together tonight, we have many copies of Dr. Baxley's book on hand, and you can either come into Barrett to pick up your copy, or you can purchase it via our website, and we'll have it ready and waiting for you. We also ship nationwide. After reading it, I can assure you it is a must-have for parents and educators alike. I also want to mention that we're thrilled to partner with the YWCA and Darien Library to host a follow-up book group discussion on Wednesday, November 17th at 8 p.m. If you'd like to join, you can visit our website for registration links. Finally, before I get on to introductions, Reena and Traci will take questions tonight. So if you have a question you'd like to ask, please place it in the Q&A and they will get to as many as possible. And now it is my pleasure to introduce Traci and Reena. Dr. Traci Baxley is a professor, consultant, parenting coach, speaker, mother to 5 biracial children, and the creator of Social Justice Parenting. She is a diversity and inclusion educator with more than 30 years of experience, with degrees in child development, elementary education, and curriculum and instruction. Dr. Baxley specializes in diversity and inclusion, anti-bias curriculum, and social justice education. She lives with her husband and 5 children in Boca Raton, Florida. Reena Ninan is a journalist and founder of Good Trouble Productions, a media company focused on creating content with purpose. She is host of a new early morning news podcast called the Recount Daily Pod, and co-host of Ask Lisa, the Psychology of Parenting podcast. I am so thrilled to invite both Dr. Traci Baxley and Reena to join me on screen. And
she has her own media company, but can't start her video.
No, that's me. I'm going to disappear. Dr. Baxley, Reena, thank you so very much for being here.
Paige, thank you so very much. First off, for having this conversation. I am so excited to have Dr. Baxley here. And I gotta say, Paige, we love the bookshop. We love the new location. I know it's been there for a while, but it's one of our favorite places in town. Dr. Baxley, the timing couldn't be any better. I just feel after last night and the election, the whole country is lit up in different ways, and our town is no exception to that. So I'm really excited to be chatting with you today. And I know you said to call you Traci. My mother gets very upset, particularly with women who have worked high in higher education to get that doctorate. So she gets very upset when she tunes in and I don't call them doctors. So I want to first kick it off and ask you, what exactly is social parenting? Social justice parenting.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm very excited about this conversation and hoping that this dialogue will continue, way beyond this hour. But social justice parenting is really a way to be intentional and purposeful in the way that we raise our children, raising our kids to really care deeply, love radically, and showing up for themselves and for others. And it really is a way to raise kids who really are more compassionate and more kind and who really believe in the power of activism. And more than anything, right, social justice parenting requires us as parents to kind of move through our own fears through self-reflection and honest dialogue, and really creating space where we can unlearn and relearn ways that we really want to be intentional about showing up for our own kids, and teaching our children really to do the same.
You know, my parents are from India, and I'm not Black. I understand what it's like to be a person of color, but I think we all come to the table with our own biases of how we think other people are, other cultures. How do you teach children social justice parenting when you might not be aware of the biases you have yourself?
Yeah, I think the first thing really is to, I mean, it's hard but necessary work, is to do the self-reflection, right? So when I work with parents, the first lesson, the first activity that I have us do together is really looking at self. We can't intentionally show up for our own children until we are willing to be open and honest about our own biases, our own childhood wounds, our own experiences, stereotypes that we may hold. And I mean, let's be honest, right? The media also shapes the way that we see the world. And so coming to terms with that and really starting to dive into that for ourselves is really the first step to really being able to do that for our kids. And I really think also another thing to think about when you are trying to establish these ways of being and the ways of showing up for others is that you really have to create what I call core values in your home. So you really have to establish what is really important to our family, how do we want to show up in the world, and what are this legacy really that we want to leave for our kids when they are outside of our home, right? When they're grown and they're having their own families, what are those core values that we want to have taught our kids as they're moving on? And so I think you don't have to be Black. You don't really have to be a person of color to really understand and have compassion for their lived experiences. And I think this idea of being open to hearing, to listening, and I keep saying this, but the relearning and unlearning some of the things that we were taught maybe when we were younger, and be conscious about the way that we're going to bring those into the way that we parent.
You know, you write in the book, you mentioned social justice parenting helps keep kids out of a privileged bubble of innocence. You know, my kids are in elementary school. I think, isn't a bubble of innocence a good thing?
You know, it's not. I'm going to be like honest and straight, right?
I love it. I want it. Yeah.
Yeah, because it's really a privilege. As a Black mom, I don't get to do that, right? I have to make sure my kids understand the world from multiple perspectives, right? They have to know how to be safe in the world. And I also want to teach them how to proudly navigate in the world in their brown skin. So I think of it too, like one of my privileges is about our family is upper middle class, right? So I don't want my kids to live in just that world. I want them to know how important it is that they really understand that a lot of children don't have the things, right? Or the means that they have. And so I don't want them to think that their lives are normal. And I want them to develop empathy and compassion for others who may be marginalized in these different identities that we hold, right?
How do you do that, Dr. Baxley?
Pardon?
How do you do that? How do you incorporate that to get kids to understand that? And is there an age where you should start that?
I think the earlier the better, right? I don't think every age you need to tell them all the gory details about what's going on in the world, but in a very age appropriate way. I think telling our kids the truth is really important, because when we shelter our children from the world, like, you know, and avoid these hard conversations, we really rob them of leaning into their own curiosity, right? Leaning into their own curious way of learning about the world. We shelter them from really learning how to be more compassionate and have more empathy. We cheat them of problem solving and learning about and celebrating and loving others when we try to hold them or keep them in this protective bubble. And I think we also, which is really important, we not having these hard conversations with our children we really miss the opportunity to develop trust and belonging and connection with their own children on the things that really matter to them as they start to go out into the world. So open dialogue is really like having the self-reflection and the open dialogue are key to really starting to have these conversations with our children about the way other people are marginalized in some ways.
That's really good. And I think as we're parenting, you know, I think everyone would agree we're very fortunate in this community. And I think COVID sort of really highlighted that for so many of us. I know I have such a heart of gratitude. My kids were able to be in school, and it's now proven, you know, mass work and the influence on their mental health of being able to have that structure has just been tremendous. But how do we move from our privilege, from that place? Because there's not one parent I know who doesn't want to educate from an honest, real perspective, sincerely educate their kids to have that compassion and that understanding of other. How do you do that when you might not have kids? You know, you live in a certain economic environment and you're not surrounded by kids who might be really struggling.
Yeah, I think the first way to really start to, and I want to talk a little bit about this word privilege, right? We've seen it a lot lately, right? We've seen it being used to really tear apart, to strike fear. We've seen it to make people feel guilty or feel like, or angry about it. And I think we need to really kind of take the sting out of that word. And I think really, if we look at all the identities that we hold, right? All of us share multiple identities. And if we start to look at our identities separately, we will recognize that there are some areas that we have privilege, right? That we, just by the fact that we have this identity, that the way our country, the United States, you know, we know that all of these identities are socially constructed, right? Depending on the space and time where you are. But if we're looking at it from the lens of the United States right now, and those privileges, those identities that are have power, and those identities that may have less power or maybe marginalized in some ways, we all hold them. And we all have them where we are marginalized in some, we all have them where we are, hold privilege. As a Black woman, right? Those are two areas that are generally marginalized in our country. Socioeconomically, I hold privilege. In my religion, I hold privilege. In my sexual identity, I hold privilege. And so if we can start to separate all of these identities and see how we can use the word privilege and the powers that come with that as a tool to change, as a tool and a means to support other people, we can stop having all these debates about whether privilege is good or bad or whether we have it or not. And so first unpacking that with our children, I'm very clear with my own kids that we have privilege, socioeconomic privilege. And with that, it comes responsibilities. What does that mean for us as a family? What is our responsibility? How do we give back in ways that we empower, we support people who don't have the things or the means that we do? So I think really talking to your children about the different ways in which you hold privilege or that you have more than something than other families, and how do we use that in ways to build and empower others.
You know, something that I found really practical that you talk about is something called the rocks of social justice. And 1 second before we get into that, I just want to remind everyone that you're welcome to submit through the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen questions, and nobody will see them, just we will see them, and we don't have to, you can submit it anonymously and we don't need to reveal your identity, but please feel free to be part of this conversation and submit questions. I want to get back to the rocks of social justice parenting, which is something that you talk about in this book. What are they and why are they so important?
Yeah, the rocks are really the building blocks of social justice parenting, right? They are the things that, especially the first two really lead into the last three. They are, and this is the other thing too. Let me back up to say this, Reena, for a second. Social justice parenting is not about politics. It's about people, right? It's about how do we raise our children to see everybody, to see the humanity in everybody, and show up for everybody, no matter who they are, right? I don't want this to be a political game. This is about raising our children to see others, right? And how they can really be responsible for the well-being of other humans. And so the rocks is really the foundation of that. It's about, the R is for reflection. So we talked about that already, the importance of self-reflection to figure out how I came to be who I am. Like, what are those things in my life that have taught me to be who I am? And then what parts of those things do I want to pass on to my children? And some of us may have gone through trauma that we don't want to pass those things on to our children. So how can we be intentional about not repeating those things that happened to us or the way that we were raised? So that's the R, reflection. The O is open dialogue. And I don't think children are ever too young to have real conversations with them. I think it creates a place where they can feel safe. It's a place where they can belong. It creates a connection between you and them. When you don't know the answers, your vulnerability teaches them that they could be vulnerable. You not having all the right answers also teaches them that they don't have to have the right answers. So having dialogue with your children about hard things, even when you don't know the answers, is really important to developing children who create more empathy, more compassion in the world. And then the C and the K are compassion and kindness. And I look at it in 3 levels: self-compassion, self-kindness, which oftentimes is very hard, right? For us to realize that we have to take time to give ourselves grace, especially as mothers. But I think it's really important that our children see us doing that in order to teach them that they can do it too. And then the next level is compassion and kindness in your family. So what are you doing for your children, for them to feel like there's compassion and kindness for them? What are you doing when they make mistakes? How do you give them grace? How do they see that? And then the third level is in your community. How are you showing compassion and kindness in your community outside of your home? How are you teaching your children to show up for people outside of your home? And then the S is social engagement. So we've taught them compassion and kindness. Obviously, that's ongoing. And then, so how do we use that in ways that empowers others? How do we show up in ways that we change our communities, that we change the world in the actions that we take? What is our responsibility? What are our roles, right? And how do we have this rippling effect that may impact somebody else outside of our homes?
I like that. How do you show them or ask them how they demonstrate that, just by, having the conversation with them and throwing it back at them to have them answer it themselves?
Absolutely. Yes. And that starts that dialogue, right? So you get to know what they're thinking. You also get to know, the thing about talking with our kids and asking them questions, we get to see where their gaps are in their learning, right? If there's something that you've talked about before, or something they're seeing on the news, something they've read, when you ask them open-ended questions, they tell you what they know. And then that is a message for you to say, they didn't understand that, or I need to go back and teach that, or they really understood that. Now let's move a little bit, give them a little bit more background information. So the more you can have these dialogues with your children, and the more you can ask them open-ended questions like, tell me more, or what do you know about that? Or where have you learned that? You get to find out more about them and be able to kind of make more connections for them.
That's one of the biggest takeaways I've learned recently in parenting, is throwing it back at them and letting them sort of tell you what they know or what they think is a good strategy. One of your friends who actually endorsed this book, my co-host, Dr. Lisa D'Amour, child psychologist, who loves your book, and unfortunately wanted to be here tonight, but couldn't because she had to be somewhere else. But it's one of the things we talk about in our parenting podcast, Ask Lisa, the psychology of parenting, is that very thing, throwing it back at them. You talk a little bit about grace, and I'm trying to find the passage that I had highlighted, and of course can't find now, but I'll paraphrase it. I loved it. You were talking about your son, your eldest son, who suffered from anxiety. And everyone knows the feeling of getting everyone out in the morning and getting them to school, and he realized he hadn't finished an assignment. Tell us a little bit about that moment, because I really identified with that, and that resonated with me.
Yeah, I mean, that incident was really the birth of social justice parenting.
Oh.
He was recently at that point diagnosed with anxiety and OCD, and we had been going through therapy, and he was learning strategies to deal with it. And he is a perfectionist. He was a perfectionist. We're working on that. But he realized that he didn't do a homework assignment. And I wanted him to employ some of the strategies that we had been learning in his therapy. And I basically said, you know, do what you can in the car. It's not that big of a deal. Let's get it done. But I won't tell the whole story, but basically he panicked and he left the house. And I didn't know he left the house because I was so busy getting the other kids ready. And when it was time to leave, he wasn't there. And I go back in the house looking for him in a panic. And that mean girl inside my head was telling me all the things I did wrong. And I wasn't in a space to give myself grace at that moment, right? I was telling myself what a terrible mom I was. Why didn't I listen? I knew how he struggled. It would have taken me one extra second to make sure he was calmed down. And, you know, looking back now, I realized that the grace that I want to give to my children and the grace that I want my children to be able to give to themselves, in that moment, I didn't have it for myself. But it really started me to think about the way I'm raising my children. I need trying to keep them safe, trying to let them know about the world. Just in context, my son, 6'2", he's biracial, but I teach him to know that he's Black in the world, right? He was now missing in my very white neighborhood, and it caused me a lot of panic. And in that moment, I realized that I need other moms to see my children and not feel panicked. I need them to see my son and say, this is my kid too. What do we need to do to get ourselves in spaces where we are a village of parents really trying to raise a village of kids? And how can we support each other in doing that?
You know, it's very shameful, but I want to admit this. I had a relative when I was growing up who every time we would drive in the car and they would see a Black homeless person on the street. Oh, lock the doors. Did we lock the doors? Did we lock the doors? Is everything okay? And I remember you don't even realize when you're growing up the way things resonate and impact you and affect the way you think. And, you know, media portrayals in movies, you know, we have things that we carry that we don't even realize we are carrying. Yes. And I'm saying this as a woman of color, you know, to you. How do we move past that? What do you think from a psychologist standpoint helps when we don't even realize that we might be harboring this and then passing it on to our kids?
Yeah, I think that is where the self-reflection really comes in, right? I see self-reflection almost like in meditation, right? When you're meditating and your brain is going a mile a minute, right? The practice is to just let those feelings, let those thoughts come and go. Like, don't judge them, let them come and go. And that's what I feel about when we are, like you're saying, like you may, as an adult, see a Black homeless person and initially feel that same panic because that's what you were taught and that's what you feel. But what I would say to do is when you're in that moment and you're starting to feel that, to sit with it, right? Don't push it away, just notice that it's happening. And then eventually what I want you to do is go beyond observing those feelings and thought and really acknowledging that you have them, because in reality, we all have biases. And nobody is immune to it. You know, living in a society where racism is rampant, sexism is rampant. We all have these ideas that we don't even know that we have. And so being mindful of them is really important, I think. And also, once you start to notice that they're coming, I think the next thing to do is really ask yourself, where is it coming from, right? Even journaling about it is helpful. Like, where did I learn this? Why is it making me feel this way? And then as a parent, you want to ask, am I passing this on to my children? Are my kids feeling this same thing? And if they are, how do I then go back to that intentionality, right? How do I intentionally try to change this behavior in small steps so that I'm not passing this on to my children? So I think acknowledging it and feeling it is really the first steps in that.
That's good, because it's not a good feeling when you realize you're doing it, and to hear you say it's okay to acknowledge it and then let it go, but acknowledge it.
Yes, definitely.
I love that. So Dr. Baxley, we're getting some questions, and I want to read some of these off to you, and feel free to go ahead and send your questions. We'd love to hear from you guys. This one says, my concern about speaking to my kids, K, second and fourth graders, is that they will take certain statements out of context, blurt it out outside the home, which may be offensive or inappropriate. My husband has told my fourth grader never to discuss politics or race outside the home, as we are not sufficiently informed, and that even if we were, we should not discuss politics or race lest they offend people. Oh, you know, this is such a, you know, coming off the elections, and I remember my son coming home from kindergarten, from elementary school one day at lunch table, and I said, I told everybody that Donald Trump is an idiot. And my husband and I looked at each other and we're like, how did this even come up at the lunch table? And he's like, well, Grandpa told me that. So I think that there are these moments that you realize people in their lives may be saying stuff that could really be detrimental, you know, to how they're thinking, or just how they're processing stuff.
Yes, it's hard. It's really hard. I'm going to talk on race first, and then I'll touch on politics a little. Okay. But basically, my thought on that is we have gone too long in our country not talking about race, right? Not talking about race has really gotten us into this, what I'm calling this fear-based parenting, right? I mean, with everything going on with critical race theory, which is really not a thing in elementary schools, but that's a whole other conversation, right? Because we are not talking about it. And now that people are trying to talk about it a little bit, certain groups of people in power want to shut it down, right? And I think we have to talk about it because we don't want to raise another generation of people who are afraid to have these conversations. We're never going to get past where our country is with racism if we don't start talking about it. We have to talk about it. We have to acknowledge that it's going on in order for us to say to our children, there are some unfair practices in our society. And it stems from the minute our country was born. There are really great things about our country, but there's some things that we've done as a country that we have to acknowledge, and we have to acknowledge that they still have impacts today. What do we do as a family? What is our responsibility? What is my responsibility in teaching you? And what do I need you to do out in the world? Now, with that said, kids are going to get it wrong, right? They're going to say some things. They're going to take one statement we said, and it's not going to be right. But that's part of the learning, right? We do the same thing when we're learning something. We don't always get it right. Sometimes it is offensive. Sometimes you have to apologize for what is said. But if we don't give them the space to start learning, if they don't start talking about it, we don't get to see where those gaps are. And if a child says something offensive, you apologize. And then you sit down with your child and say, remember last week when we were talking about skin color, or we're talking about how unfair this was. I want to come back and tell you a little bit more, or I've done a little bit more research on that, and this is what I now know, or whatever, however that conversation looks. But I think it's important that we talk about race because we're never going to move past it. And we don't want to raise another generation of children who, the elephant in the room, but we're not going to talk about it.
Oh, that's interesting. So would you encourage then parents to talk to kids about politics, even though they might not be fully aware to grasp it? I mean, is there an age where you think you shouldn't?
I think when we talk about race and other identities like that, I think we should teach our children that that's not politics. That's about being a good human being, and separate politics from that. Because I think where we're in trouble now is that we are attaching politics to everything about being a good human, right? Compassion and love, unconditional love, and just humanity. It should not be wrapped up into what party you are affiliated with. Mm-hmm. And so in that sense, I would talk to my kids about being a good pro-justice, compassionate human being. And then this is what it means to be a Republican or Democrat in terms of ideology, in terms of, conservative economics, and those kinds of things, general social issues. But I want my kids to know I'm raising you to be a giver. I'm raising you to be compassionate. I'm raising you to be an upstander. and it has nothing to do with politics.
Another question that I have here is, someone says that they hear a lot of talking about kindness as a way to activism. You share some really beautiful anecdotes in your book in particular about kindness. Can you sort of expand on the role of kindness and how that plays into this work and the idea that kindness requires courage?
Yes, so I look at compassion as the feeling, right? When you feel, you feel a certain way about somebody and their situation. And kindness is compassion in action. So kindness is the action part of feeling compassionate for others. And I think when we look at kindness, it requires courage, right? Because sometimes my being kind to somebody who may not agree with me, I am taking a risk, right? I'm taking a risk that somebody can hear me or is willing to listen to me. Nowadays, we're really taking a risk of even physical altercation can happen, right? So when you are teaching your kids to be kind, you're really teaching them to be courageous and stepping out of the what ifs could happen if I do this great thing or if I stand up for somebody else. And I think in teaching kindness, we are teaching our children to think about others and not only think about self. There's a lot of narcissism that we're finding in society. A lot of that has to do with the way that we're raising our children. I really believe that. And I think when we are practicing this vulnerability and this courage, it really is a gateway to showing up and being more kind.
I love that kindness is courage. I've never had somebody quite put it that way, the way you have, that's a great way to explain it to kids for standing up. How do we move past the stereotypes that are in our head that people might look at about certain ethnic groups or people?
Yeah, I think exposure. We have to get out of our bubbles, right? We have to know people's stories. We have to be open to hearing somebody's lived experience, even though it's different from yours. I think a lot of times when I tell, like say I'm telling my colleague about my fears or what I feel inside my body every time I show up for work or every time I show up at the stores, instead of a colleague saying, I didn't know that happened, I sometimes get told that doesn't really happen, or you're overthinking it, right? So when you deny me my lived experiences, you are not open to really dropping some of your stereotypes or your biases or the way that you show up. So I think it's really important that we listen to people's lived experiences and accept them as truths and not question that for them. And I think also this idea of being aware that these stereotypes are happening is a really great start to saying, okay, I'm feeling this in my body, or, oh my God, as soon as I saw her or I saw him, this is what I thought. And then once you are acknowledging that you have those feelings, you then start to think about, okay, I'm going to be conscious about that feeling, or I'm going to be not act on that. And then slowly start to unlearn the things that your body is telling you to be truths, even though you know it's not truths.
So it's interesting. I've got a question here asking if you would address the high percentage of carjackings, 56% committed by young Black males. They sent me a link, and the link, I appreciate your question, and this is why I'm asking it. When I clicked on the link, the study is from the Department of Justice taken from 1994 to 2003, which is 20 years ago, right? So people take facts like this, and again, this is statistics from 20 years ago. I'm not dismissing whoever sent this, but I just think it's a great example of how sometimes people take information, and it might not even be the current or latest information, but then try to use it to make a point. And I'm not trying to isolate anybody, but I'd love for you to comment on this, and I appreciate your question.
Yeah, I'm trying to find the connection between the question and what we're talking about, but I think again, this is an idea of stereotyping, right? And part of it too, we need to see the connection between systemic racism, right? Which includes less opportunities, right? Less education. People are surviving the best way they can, right? Some of the generational trauma is part of it too, right? And if this is my lived experience, right? This is the way that I'm treating society. This is a way that I behave. This is a way, I mean, we all know about the self-fulfilling prophecy, right? If this is how the world sees me too, and I'm not making excuses for people who are breaking the law, right? If you're breaking the law, there should be some repercussions for that, right? But I also want us to see that when we're looking at systemic racism, we're looking at a lot of opportunities that are not presented in Black communities in particular. When we're talking about education, we're talking about the banking system, we're talking about housing. All of those lend themselves to people making drastic decisions in their lives in some way or form. So I guess that's what I have to say about that.
I appreciate that. I appreciate you taking that question. You talk about mothers against drunk driving and that grassroots level that really made a difference. I mean, it transformed our country in getting people to create legislation and to look at that problem that was taking so many young lives, period. How do we translate social justice parenting without being isolating to people in the community and helping it grow in places like our own neighborhoods?
Yeah, I think if we could lean into that idea of creating space where compassion and kindness can grow, right? If we can, I don't think any political party would disagree that we need more compassion and kindness in the world, right? And I think if we can really begin to see everybody as these humans, create spaces of belonging, and seeing that belonging is a basic human need and a basic human right, we can really start to make shifts. And I think, and I'm going to go back to kind of what I said earlier, I think a lot of the divide in our country right now is rooted in fear, right? And I was saying this before we went live, is that I'm so interested in doing studies around fear-based parenting, like how fear is really being used as a weapon really to keep us from listening to each other and from seeing each other. People are fearful for different reasons. Maybe it's they're afraid of the unknown. Maybe it's this idea of change. Change is really hard for people. And if you feel like that change is about you losing some power, that's really hard. People are fearful of saying the wrong things, saying too much, not saying enough, exposing their children to hard things. They're afraid of their kids asking the wrong questions and not having the answers. They're afraid of being vulnerable, right? Of being open with their own feelings. And I think we really have to move through the fear, as hard as it is, in order to really see how current policies and practices really harm groups of people. And so if we could start looking at how do we create policies and practices and ways of showing up that really emote more compassion, more kindness, more empathy, more love. I think I'm very hopeful in that. And I talk in the book about active hope, right? I'm not just hoping and praying that this will happen, but I'm trying to do something about it. So that active hope, we can all lean into that active hope where our hope is followed by action. I think we can get there. I'm still hopeful that we can find a way to really lean into how we can be better humans to all humans.
I love that. You talk about fear, and there's a great question just popped up. The role of kindness, as you described, is so critical to change, particularly in an era where some people are nervous to speak about racial issues just out of fear of saying the wrong thing, exactly what you were talking about, Dr. Baxley, and being labeled as intolerant or racist. How can we show our children to approach these situations productively, to not assume ill intent behind words when people misspeak, to address it with the person accordingly without attack, but also to express progress and growth in response to that. So often you say the wrong thing and it's over.
Yes, I am a big proponent of active listening, right? And if somebody said something that offended me, I would say, tell me more, right? Tell me more about that. Why do you feel that? Or where is that coming from? Just to make sure that I'm understanding what they're saying. Now, this is kind of the tough road, right? Finding the sweet spot. We want to teach our kids to be compassionate and kind, but we also want to teach our kids, well, I shouldn't say but, and we want to teach our kids to hold boundaries, right? So let me give you this example. I was on a podcast, and on the podcaster's Instagram feed, he posted me and a clip of something that we talked about. And in that feed, somebody said something negative about my response. And I'm sure it was speaking about kindness or compassion or something. And I think the question was like, what do we need to teach our kids? And I said something that had to do with something with kindness and compassion, whatever. And the response was kind of negative about what I thought we need to teach our kids. And then he said the things that he thought kids need to learn. Mm-hmm. And so my response was, we don't disagree with that. Like what you're saying, I agree with. And that we do still need to teach it's not something that they learn. We do need to teach kindness and compassion. And it is through our modeling for them, right? The way that we show up, we are actually teaching them how to show up. Mm. And then his response was something very negative about my children. And I like to engage in conversation, even when the conversation with a person whose opinions and perspectives are different from mine, because it's how we learn, right? It's how we grow. But when it got personal, I knew how to hold my boundaries, and I knew that that was not okay. The first second was for me to go at it when you're talking about, my mama bear came out. But then I thought, hold space, hold your boundaries. And then my retort was something very, we can agree to disagree. Thank you for responding. And then I knew that I need to hold boundaries. So I think we don't want our kids to get into these wrestling matches or these arguments with people who don't agree with them. But we do want to teach our kids to listen, because the more perspectives that we can have, really the better and the more well-rounded we are. And so I think it's just important to teach them to hold healthy boundaries as it is to teach them to be kind and to be compassionate.
This is so great. What do you think it is? What is the secret to raising kids who are kind and compassionate? I don't think there's a parent out there who wouldn't want to raise a kind and compassionate child. But what do you think really makes or breaks whether it gets into a kid?
I think it's our responsibility as parents to model it, right? To be consistent with it in our daily lives, not just tell our kids. Like there's a study done by Parents Magazine, the 2020, that asked parents what was the most important thing for their kids to know or to do or to be. And it was kindness, to show kindness, right? Mm-hmm. And then there's a Harvard study the same year that basically said that parents say that they want their kids to be good people, but when they ask the kids say, my grades are more important, that I get into this school, that I do these classes, right? So there's a disconnect of what we're saying we want for our kids and the way we're really showing up. And if we really want to show our kids that kindness and compassion really matters, we have to show that in the way that they show up every day. And I think our daily practices of kindness and compassion, having dialogue around that, making it a habit in our homes that we're practicing that into the world, so that it becomes normalized for our kids.
Mm-hmm. You talk about a concept called radical love. What is that, and how do you introduce that to children?
Yes, radical love is really this notion of unconditional love that is spread to people in ways that it makes ripples in the world, right? It's like, you don't have to be my family for me to radically love you, because it's about listening, open dialogue, holding space for people, acknowledging their hurt, acknowledging when people are marginalized and how we can show up for them in a way that is kindness and positive. And even when you don't agree with me, right, I'm going to love you through that, through this lens of human kindness, right? And I think if we begin to teach our children what radical love is, what that feels like, they will go into the world being open to spreading radical love. And again, it's not that we agree with what everybody is saying, but that we're treating everybody as human as we can in a world that we're not seeing each other as human and as humans right now.
It's not a question, but a comment. I just want to say a huge thank you to you, Dr. Baxley, for taking on these very difficult questions and answering with such thoughtful responses. Rockstar exclamation point. That's a really
thank
comment.
you.
Yes,
I really appreciate that.
That was really lovely. You were talking about humanity. How do you get your kids to see the humanity in everybody?
I think it's learned. I think it's learned practice. It really is. I mean, we're born with some compassion, right? But I think for kids to really internalize that and it become second nature to who they are, we have to practice that at home. And I think not just practicing it outside of our home, but really, how do we show up for our kids? You know, if our kids I tell a story in the book about my fourth child. He was cutting the grass, right? And he was trying to do a good deed. And he poured oil in the gas tank of the lawnmower instead of gas. And my husband, he lost it. And my baby son, my youngest son, he stepped in and said, Dad, he was just trying to be helpful. He was trying to do the right thing. He made a mistake, and we all make mistakes. So in those kind of moments, I realized that my kids recognize when it's time to step up with compassion, you know, for their siblings, right? Because it's been poured into them. And if we're not pouring that into our kids, it's hard for it to show up when it needs to be showed up. You want it to be automatic so that when a time comes where they need to stand up, they don't have to think about it, right? They've already done it. We also do a lot of role playing, especially when my kids were younger. If somebody says this or somebody does that, what's a good thing that you can say back? You know, how does that feel in your body when you say that? If you want to tell people no, what are 5 things that we can say that they're already in our back pocket that we can say without us having to think? Because oftentimes, obviously, when kids are in situations, they freeze up and they don't know what to say. But if you role play it at home and they already have this language ready, it makes it so much easier for them to be able to stand up for themselves, to stand up for others, to show kindness in ways that they make a difference in somebody else's lives.
I love that they make a difference in somebody else's lives. You talk a little bit about performative activism and allyship. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so allyship is these actions or behaviors and these practices that we do to advocate or amplify the voices of others who may be marginalized in that particular identity. And when you are practicing performative activism, it is where you are often centering yourself and you're taking up space, right? So when I look back right after George Floyd's death, there were a lot of influencers or a lot of people who were putting the black squares up on their Instagram posts or their Facebook or whatever, and then nothing else happened, right? So when you're doing performative activism, you're speaking more than you're listening, you're taking up space, you are using what you think is like the end jargon to use, that you are not, if you're still not doing the work, like activism is not something you can do or put down when it gets hard, right? It's continual work. And instead you want to be like an activated ally where you are centering the cause and not yourself, where you are making space for other people's voices who are more marginalized in that identity to be centered. You're listening more than you're talking, right? You're learning. you're not centering yourself in a way that your experiences matter more. It's a great example. One of my clients who was had a trauma around sexual assault. And when she showed up in like Black communities and Black spaces to be an ally, she would tell her story about sexual assault. The idea behind it was to say, I have trauma too. I understand what you're going through. But when you're centering yourself in your trauma, when you're trying to show up for somebody else in that space, that's not activated allyship, right? Your trauma doesn't trump the trauma of somebody else's in that space. And if you're showing up as an ally, you shouldn't bring yourself and your experiences as center stage. Mm-hmm. And I think the most important advice that I can give to somebody who is really trying to do allyship work is this idea. I always hear, being the voice for the voiceless, or speaking for others. And, we all have voices. It's just a matter of whose platform is being used and who is not having a bigger enough platform to be heard. Mm-hmm. So make sure that you're using your identities and the power of your identity to make space for others to be heard. Mm-hmm. You're not their mouthpiece, and you're not giving voice to voiceless people. You're providing space that their voices can be heard.
Providing space. So I shouldn't interject how I feel. Let the person say, have their piece, have their moment, and listen, which is so hard.
Absolutely,
Dr. Baxley, sometimes.
And I think you speak when you're asked to speak, right? If you're at let's say a Black Lives Matter movement, and they ask you to speak, then you should be speaking, right? Because they're asking you to bring your experiences, but don't project yourself or don't center yourself around the causes of other people. Mm-hmm. You want to empower, you want to support, you want to stand behind, but you don't want to center.
Mm-hmm. What do you think it means to make a difference in the lives of marginalized people? Because you talk about this concept, I think people want to be the voice for the voiceless. They think they know, what to put center stage and what to sort of doggy pile on. But what does it really mean to be supportive of the marginalized?
Yeah, I think it's about using your privileged identity, right? We've already talked about, we all have them, right? To hold space, to create space, to amplify the lived experiences and voices of those who may not have the same privilege in that identity. It's not so much about helping as it is about empowering, supporting, and standing with.
Mm-hmm. Empowering and supporting and standing with. In the last few minutes we have left, and we're open to any other questions you guys may have, can you give me a sense of just some tangible things, whether your child is in elementary, junior, or preparing for college? What can we as parents do to support them, to make them aware of social justice parenting? Help us in social justice parenting, but make them aware of the world around them.
Yes, again, open dialogue, talking about what's going on in the news, talking about what they're seeing on TV, reading the books. And everybody says read diverse books. But even beyond reading diverse books, you need to talk about what you're reading. You need to unpack those things. You need to ask these open-ended questions to your children, elementary up, right? What does that mean? What do you think the author was saying? What do you think the person who is not the main character, what do you think their views would be? Who's holding power in this story? Why do you think that is? So talking to your kids about the books really is one way of really having these conversations going. And I think gathering your kids around a passion, right? I think we all have things in our lives that we are passionate about and that we want to see changes in. Start there. Start with something that feels a little bit easy, that you have some knowledge around already, right? So you're not starting new. And then make some activism or some actions around those things. So once you start doing that with the things that are easier for you, that you have more knowledge of, then how do I use these same actions to then go into a different space? But I think if you want to raise children who create belonging in the world, these children who are going to be activists, agitators, allies, right? you have to practice that at home now when they're younger. And they have to feel that it is something that is sacred to your home. It's something that's part of the core values that you're teaching your kids. And I think that if everybody can do this one thing, right? Go home tonight, go home this weekend when you have more time, and sit with your partner and your kids if they're old enough. And I think 4 or 5 is old enough and older, and say, what do you think our core values are in our home? Like if we had to write 3 or 4 things down that are sacred to our home, that we want you to know, that we reinforce in this house, what are those things? And write those down, have them around your house, talk about them often. We would talk about ours, during our family meetings or whatever's going on. And then when things get rocky, when your kids are out of line, when you're out of line, you have this GPS, right? These core values that will always bring you back to center. Did what I say to my kids, the way I screamed at my kid today, did that align with my core values? And if it didn't, then it's my responsibility to be vulnerable and say to my kid, you know what? Today I lost it. I screamed. I should not have been screaming at you that way. It doesn't align with our core values of how we treat other people. And I apologize. I'm sorry for that. And I'm going to do better next time, right? When your kids are out of line, you say, does this align with our core values, right? And when you have established these core values in your home, it's easier to do the right thing, according to what's important to your family, because you have this map or this GPS that will always bring you back in alignment. So I would say take time to really establish what those core values are. We have 5 in our house that are kind of our map, that, we can check ourselves to see whether what we did was in alignment with that and get ourselves back on track. So it's not about being perfect, right? It's about being vulnerable, being open and learning, relearning, unlearning, so that we show up better each time.
My children do this every year in their classrooms. We've never once done it in our home. So I think what a great reminder that this could be so beneficial. Dr. Baxley, I want to thank you so much. I feel, we're living in a country more and more that is just so polarized and so divided, so refreshing to hear your approach and how we can be more inclusive, and also giving us tangible things to walk away with. I want to thank everyone. It is a fabulous book, and I want to welcome Paige back to say the goodbyes. Thank you again.
Thank you, Reena. Thank you, Dr. Baxley. Thank you to all of our partners again for supporting this work tonight. And thank you to all of you. I do wish we could have gathered in person, and maybe for the next book, we'll get Dr. Baxley up here to Connecticut. I also want to emphasize, for those of you who haven't yet gotten a copy, it's just chock full of really wise nuggets and so many things. I know I'm going to be referring to it over and over. And Dr. Baxley, I just can't say how grateful we are for joining us in community tonight and sharing your wisdom with us. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate the time.
And I wish everyone a lovely evening. We'll see you soon. Bye-bye.